Right, well, thanks for the very humbling introduction. I've got some, I mean, apart from just putting plus on here, that means it was a bit open. If you saw me in the corner, I was just taking on of some of the things I heard and trying to add a few slides and realising the formatting doesn't work. And yeah, not supposed to tell people the background to that, but some thanks and gratitude, first of all, to today specifically for Chris Rowe for putting this together, amongst others. And Laurie, both of them, I keep saying that really we sold the company to these two guys because, you know, personalities matter a lot, and, you know, it's in safe hands, so happy for that. And then there's a few, I'm not going to go through the details, there's a mixture of people on here that are a bit inspirational, who I worked with, who I still work with, who there's some of them are here today. And two at the bottom, Drew and Daniel, who really, you know, made it possible to do what we did in the US, which was, you know, really go from having nothing in here 3 years ago to being, 20 NBA teams and 15 NFL teams and et cetera, even kind of without trying too hard, just through word of mouth and these guys talking to a lot of people. So Blake, starting with something that Blake brought up, because I think this is really important. So this is nothing to do with asymmetries actually, or not a lot, but I think it's really important. So on the left here, you've got 3 force time curves from the same elite soccer player who knows how to jumped a few times. And I don't just mean that facetiously, I mean jumps as in CMJs. There are people on that side as well, unfortunately. Okay, so what you're seeing there is I've circled the blue line. The blue line is velocity. And what you can see is that there's an odd one out on there, the third one at the bottom. Even without any numbers, that kind of looks a bit flat, doesn't it? Right? And what you see is there's a few dotted lines thrown down there, and people have talked about eccentric deceleration, RFD. And if you look at the first dotted line, the bottom of minimum force, and you go across one, and then there's a blue line that's the end of the concentric phase. And I'm going to really resist the temptation of going to that screen, and because you guys won't know what I'm talking about. But if you look at that peak value, just to the left of it, there's an area that is the eccentric deceleration phase. And on the first two, if you just judge it by the first two, there's a kind of a space there. There's a bit of time spent in there. And then if you look at the bottom one, that kind of phase has almost disappeared. And I think it was something that Daniel said, is there any acceleration? Well, if you don't get any acceleration going down, then you don't need any deceleration. So one of the issues that we have with eccentric variables, which get slammed occasionally for not being reliable, and this whole thing we've seen from Dave Howard's work, that you can get those variables reliably measured, but you've got a lack of acceleration or a lack of velocity in that eccentric phase. Now I said let's throw up the blue line because you don't have to look at any numbers, you can just look at this curve and see it's flat. In other words, there's not been a negative velocity created. So, not decal but decel. Now if you look at just some of the variables, the coefficient of variation that's come out as a result of those across those 3 trials, and just picked out 2 of them. Flight time, beautiful, 2.9, almost as good as Dave Howard's CV. So that very different force time profile managed to create a flight time that wouldn't tell you that there was anything different about those 3 trials. And you see some higher variability in some others, but if we look at eccentric mean power, we're lost, right? If we use that mean of those 3 trials for any type of profiling or any type of measurement, we're unlikely to see the signal through the noise. Okay, so one of the key points here is that the eccentric phase is very vulnerable, and you mentioned the word threshold. I don't have the answer to this yet, but I think we need to do this, is that we've got standards or criterion for saying this was a squat jump. right? If I did too much of an eccentric phase, then it's not a squat jump, do it again. I think we need to get to the point where we have a criterion for the CMJ that there is a threshold level of velocity in the downward phase for it to qualify as a CMJ, because in a CMJ, you will look at eccentric variables. You will expect to see the capacities around braking in that test. And if you don't create any velocity, then you're not going to get any measure of the capacity to slow down, right? You wouldn't test your brakes at 2 miles an hour. You might if you was trying to sell a car that had no good brakes. But so this isn't meant to be clear. It's just one approach. There's 4 variables on the left that have different colored or have red highlights. And the idea here, this was just someone doing a bit of script and saying when you pull out the variables, there's a eccentric peak velocity is one of them on there, and if it's higher than 10% CV, it shows up red. And then you go back to your trials and you can have a glance and say, right, maybe this variable is not going to enter into my analysis. But you've still got your immediate feedback to the athlete. So it hasn't affected jump height. There's not going to be, the world isn't going to collapse, but it's not going to contaminate your longitudinal analysis. So as much as ForceDecks is one click, maybe that's sometimes a little bit of a danger. As we think, well, it's going to solve all the messy data and all the different protocols. It doesn't. It's not that clever. I hate to say, wish it was, but we still need to think. So, conversations, another point that came up quite a lot, and they're just echoing that really what we have is many times, and this is the same potentially with asymmetries, and we're going to talk about post-ACL, and I want to show you, you're going to go, well, you could take the perspective, well, I kind of knew they were going to be asymmetrical after an ACL. I knew they were, been injured, they're going to be asymmetrical. Okay, so a lot of the time, a force plate data isn't actually telling you something you didn't know. It might be confirming it. I will show you that probably it might reveal something you didn't know, but that's maybe a small percentage of the time. But whether it confirms or reveals, it always quantifies. So, okay, yeah, I knew that, but how much? And I've spoken to one physio I have in mind at an English football club. He said, I don't need that stuff. I can see asymmetries. Okay, I said, you've got better eyes than me. But, some asymmetries you can see. You still probably can't quantify them with the eye. I would say, speaking of eyes, that you might then want to add some layers of kinematics to understand, or video to understand where those are. But without quantifying, it's difficult to know whether you've been effective, and effective in all parts of the neuromuscular system that you might want to be addressing. I used to have a bird of peace on here because early days it was, medical staff, sports science, fitness, and I would go into these soccer clubs and say, this is hopefully bringing you guys together. I know here you're already really talking, and the faces told me I shouldn't have said that. Drop a clanger. So I'm not trying to make peace because everyone's already at peace, right? But better conversations between. Now, I'm going to cover not all of this. I'm just going to get us to review that what we're looking at here is the bottom area, the rehab. Matt's going to talk about some specific case studies. I'm going to go into some of the details around some of the variables. I was going to attempt to do isometrics as well. We're going to focus on the jumps. I'm getting a bit more realistic in my old age about how much I can cover. And I also want to cover the aspects of performance deficits, because we often think of post-injury there's going to be asymmetries. But are there performance variables that are residual deficits well beyond return to play, return to sport, that may help us understand and maybe untangle the puzzle of recurrence? Because although we don't know that these variables that are residuals of asymmetries have never been shown to necessarily be predictors of future injury, we suspect that probably contributes to the relationship between the biggest risk factor for prior injury, for future injury, is prior injury. That's out of out of the blue, but it's supposed to be there. I just wanted to cover very quickly something around profiling in a sport that's probably lots of different sports in one in terms of the positional differences, and these are just some of the variables you've been hearing about. This is just one way of visualizing that. Those from North America will know what those acronyms refer to, others might not. I didn't a little while ago. And then you've got a mean for the whole, for the sport as a whole, or for the positions as a whole, and then some of the performance variables. So that could be something that could be churned out for various sports, and I know that's kind of a key thing. So echoing Daniel's point around CMJ as being a means to get more data and maybe more often. I like the concept, for example, of Ben Rosenblatt at GB Hockey, who was doing, or having the hockey players leading up to Rio doing one jump a day. So every day, and in fact he didn't even test them, he got them to test each other. You couldn't get, I don't know if you could get pro soccer players to test each other. They might change the name to Bugs Bunny on the player ID or something, but you know, GB women's hockey, they were quite serious and they did it. And so one jump a day just to try and track neuromuscular performance. And within that, a richness of information. In Colombia, where I live now, Bosco profile is it. Everyone does the Bosco profile, no matter what your sport is. It's kind of just a thing, and it's contact mat, and it's a lot. And there's a different culture around people's time. Colombia is a country where the more important you are, the later you arrive, and you expect not to be on time. So athletes wait around, and they're used to it. We know that that's not going to work in a lot of places. So minimum dose is probably the best way to go. The smallest amount of testing, get the most data out of it, and then see if we can build around that where necessary and justify why are we doing a single leg jump as well? Why are we doing a drop jump as well? And we actually going to take that data out of our laptop into somewhere and do something with it. So I just want to contrast some specific other jump tests and make sure that I'm not being ever accused of only liking the CMJ or only advocating the CMJ. Single leg jump is great. From an asymmetry perspective, there is some literature out there that suggests it's a better way of characterizing asymmetries. I don't know that I'd agree with better. I think it's an alternative way, and we'll see that you can have very different asymmetries in a single leg jump against a bilateral jump. The percentage asymmetries can be very different. And when I'd say, well, if I was going to choose one test, so why not just do the single leg jump? Because then you'll get performance and you'll get pure asymmetries, if you like. Well, then you're left with some issues. So first of all, it takes twice as long. It's more of a technical test, so they're not going to be quite as good as it. You're probably not going to get as clean a data from that. Is this, I think I pressed this if it's going off, do I? Looks like that's what it did last time before it went to sleep, so, okay. So the other thing is, if you've got baseline CMJ data, you're more likely to be able to implement it sooner in the case of injury, right? Because you've got lower impact forces on a double leg jump. And you've got this thing called expression of compensatory strategies. Someone mentioned Inoka today, and I was thinking of that concept of neural wisdom, i.e. the system will adjust, the neuromuscular system adjusts to avoid loading in areas that maybe it cannot load, or there's tissue issues, or there's inhibition, etc. If I've got 2 feet on the ground, then I've got an easy way to express those compensatory strategies, and you can measure that. If I've got 1 leg on the ground and I've got a problem in the knee, then I probably need some more information like kinematics or something to be able to understand where that compensation has gone, because it's not going to be to the other leg because it's not on the ground. It's going to have to be inter-joint compensation. And so this is a kind of easy way of saying, right, I don't want to don't want the forces on that side, they're going on that side. And that's a first step. I'm not saying it's the last step in that. And as I think Drew showed, if you want to get an RFD, concentric RFD, you're better off doing a squat jump because you'll get a clean RFD. You won't in a CMJ in many cases. But then you lose the eccentric, you lose the SSC capabilities. And the drop jump, well, it's faster. We all like speed and we want to test faster SSC, but familiarization time couldn't be an issue, right? If you haven't got a force platform and you're using a contact mat, then obviously that's probably better than a CMJ. But I mean, seen players that take 2.5 months, elite players, to start to flatten out in terms of their drop jump performance. We were looking for fatigue and just getting better, technically better and better at it. And again, the question about rehab, when you're going to use drop jump in rehab, probably quite late. I've got this great picture of an Arsenal player in season about to do a drop jump, and it's 30 centimetres. It looks like you're going to get him to jump off a cliff. They did not want to do drop jumps in season. I know if you're at Connaught Rugby, you don't get a say, but still. So one of the key things about the CMJ is that it's repeatability, it's reliability across 3 phases. So you get the least noise as possible, and then you can see a signal, i.e. change related to training, fatigue, etc., etc. But you'll always know that you've got a toolbox that contains other tests that could be used appropriately. So let's go on to the asymmetries, and obviously asymmetries always, people immediately associate asymmetry injury. There's some nice work from review from Chris Bishop and some work from that group at Middlesex around asymmetries being related to lower performance. But I'm not going to talk about that link. I remember receiving this from someone actually in basketball quite early on when I really didn't know what a basketball player looks like although they look a lot different. And he said, does anything jump out at you? And I scanned through some of the few variables that are in ForceDecks. And I noticed this kind of quite interesting opposing large asymmetries in the landing in the eccentric phase. And Constance said, well, that's quite interesting. I said, why? He said, well, we took that in the morning, and in the afternoon he ruptured his ACL it was a draft player on the court. Now, does that mean that large asymmetries predict ACLs? It doesn't. It's a case study. And we'll see large asymmetries post-ACL, but again, I want to emphasize that the actual data around prospective risk with jump asymmetries for ACLs or other injuries, it doesn't exist, hasn't been done. It's being done, doing some analysis on that now, but there is enough data around interlimb asymmetries in isokinetic testing being a risk factor, and there's some other data I'm going to show you. But we can't conclude now that $1 million question. So how much is too much asymmetry, and is it, who's going to get injured out of a group of asymmetry, spread of asymmetry? We're not there yet. So, and I want to go back to, I guess there's a bit of a story around. Laurie asked me what's coming, how different are the things we looked at 10 years ago to today? And I said, well, I've kind of got a bit of a storyline in there around tests and variables that will also give you some information. It's just not just a kind of history lesson of jump asymmetries. And this was for me, this was where I got inspired by, Tim Hewitt, and Greg Myers was a PhD student at that time. And I remember reading, I think it was Tim Hewitt's PhD about landing forces and female ACL. It was 2001. I was like, this is amazing, right? And I basically wrote to him and said, can I come over? Spent a week in Cincinnati Children's Hospital and looked at what he was doing. And they were doing drop jumps, and they kept doing drop jumps. And basically the body of, he must have 250 papers on drop jump kinetics and kinematics, and particularly trying to solve the female ACL riddle. But one thing that I'd never seen before was landing forces, and that concept of landing forces, not just how much what force you can produce, but landing force asymmetry being associated or being a specific residual of asymmetry. And in fact, in his early study, high peak landing forces being a risk factor as well. There was very few ACLs in the study, but nonetheless, that whole area and the concept that, okay, one, it's a residual of prior injury, 18 months, 2 years post ACL, potential risk factor, and that they were suggesting over the years that this should be a criterion for return to play as well. So, well, this is the 6-month data time back in 2002, and Phil Graham-Smith's in the back here. And one of the things that came out from that analysis, straight out, that was quite quick, because October we went back, there were some players that had been injured between, were returned to play, and just looked at very simple metrics, peak force and an RFD within a jump. It was actually, didn't even know what RFD it was at the time. We'd probably be today described as breaking RFD. It was just from minimum force upward. And the peak force was back to, this is a combination of 4 players, 8 legs. Peak force was back to pre-levels. RFD was, I think, 25, 26% down as a mean. And it had also dropped off in the uninjured side. So I thought, oh, we're now starting to see that this tool may be an additional layer to the physio, to the sports medicine staff, because the isokinetic machine was what was sitting in the corner at Man United, was used a little bit as a coat hanger, because how can you test that many players on IKD? It's usually if they're already injured, but the idea was to go in and get some benchmark data. So that was the first sort of proof that maybe that benchmark data could give you a little bit more information about where the player was. This is then a case study, an unfortunate one, but from an academy player at Arsenal Football Club, so another elite soccer player who, before T1, before rehab time 1, was an ACL. About 2 months apart, these two tests. What you see here is jump height improvements, concentric force asymmetry decreases, and then he's player 5. So just in terms of some of the metrics around GPS on pitch, it doesn't look bad. Again, I'm not claiming to be any expert. Other people in here about GPS, but you know, his metrics there doesn't look like someone that's struggling as he's returning. And just there's the percentage-wise of those deficits. So what happened next invited us to re-examine that data. Now, I wasn't working there. I was doing pre-season testing and research and bits and pieces, like 2012. So contralateral ACL within 6 to 8 weeks after this test, yet sprinting faster, on-pitch stuff, jumping higher, reduced concentric asymmetry. So thought, well, what's going on? And that was a moment to come back and say, well, let's see what were his peak force asymmetries. And you can see here, you can see here that the actual landing asymmetries had increased between the 2 time periods, which is a strange one. So we've got a reduced concentric. It's actually not strange. I've seen it time and again, but conceptually maybe it's counterintuitive. A lot of things are getting better, and this load acceptance capability is actually getting worse. So what's happened? First off, jumped higher. So the impact forces have gone up around 1,300 newtons, 130 kilos. So higher jumping, more impact. And why is the mechanism by which those landing force asymmetries are getting worse is that majority of that additional force is being absorbed on the healthy side. So hence, it doesn't mean that the limb is getting worse. It's actually just, and that's where I'll beat this up a few times. The asymmetry percentages are your starting point. As soon as you're tracking asymmetries, you have to look at left and right, on their own. If you just look at asymmetry, you don't know what's going on percentage-wise. No matter how fancily you calculate percentages, I know there are lots of ways of doing it, you must go to the left and right because you want to understand what's going on. Asymmetry percentage is just a top-level metric. So again, no link or very little correlation between performance improvements and load acceptance deficits. So what we did was we kept going, and I thought, well, not many footballers, soccer players are going to be doing lots of drop jumps, although actually we did drop jumps in pre-season, but in season they're not that good at it. Can we see what the landing force asymmetries and other asymmetries in the drop jump versus the CMJ versus a single leg jump, just in terms of jump height, as a residual marker of prior injury, i.e. replicating the sort of Hewitt approach. You know, this is what the player looks like. They've had injuries prior to, so they're considered healthy, but what are the residual deficits? Comparing healthy, in our criterion, players that hadn't been injured at all in the previous season against those that had any lower extremity injury. Now, in this sample, there was no ACLs actually in the end in Arsenal Football Club in those, I think it was 3 years worth of data, and we're now adding to it. And talking about history of improving analysis, it was a very crude analysis, i.e. it was peak force, peak takeoff force in the CMJ, peak landing, and then the drop jump first and second landing asymmetries, and the last one is the single leg jump height. And the only thing that came out as a strong differentiator between prior and non-prior injury was peak landing force in the CMJ. Now, we didn't do eccentric decel, impulse, eccentric decel, RFD. As I said, this was the old days. And that's why I'm trying to find all the files in the different computers and put this all together. I was saying to someone about that, to redo that analysis with more variables. But strong effect size, statistically significant, and what you can see here is the individual player data. So the white triangles are the players that had absolutely no injuries in the previous season, and all of them had below 15% except for one, and I think it was a goalkeeper, and they have some weird asymmetries, healthy weird asymmetries. Why 15%? I'm probably contradicting myself, because where does that 15% come from? I just put it because it was out there, but I'm not saying that 15 is a cut point for anything. It's just a kind of often used and abused number of a cut point. The other thing that was important was that those asymmetries that we measured, there was no association between any of them, except for the first and the second drop jump asymmetry, same test and both landings. But no association between single leg jump height asymmetries and peak takeoff, and the details are here, but I won't spend long on that. The only one that was close was, and that yellow highlight has moved in my formatting, was between drop jump landing 1 and 2. But you can see the P values, the R values. For example, peak takeoff force asymmetry and peak landing force asymmetry, R of 0.03, no association. Needed translation. So this is a beautiful-ish vertical force curve. This is one side, and this is another side. Again, I can see from my eyes, I don't need any analysis, I can see there's some asymmetries here. But you can see on here that there are asymmetries that are magnitude, but there's also some issues about, let's say, the quality of those force time curves that we'll talk about. This is a post-ACL athlete. You can see that little horseshoe in the concentric phase. You can see some gaps leading prior to that in the eccentric decel phase. You can see some differences that we'll go into a bit more detail.
How many months is that?
This particular one, I think, is 6 months.
6 months post?
Yeah.
Max effort job.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk about that as well. Again, this is another way of looking at it. This is grouped 23 on the right-hand side, 23 post-ACL elite soccer players, and on the left, 23 elite. Sorry, not 23. I think it's more in the control group. And the reason I show that is because what you're seeing on the bottom part of that graph is the grey areas are where there was significant asymmetries in that force time curve. And all we're seeing here is the eccentric and the concentric phase. The landing's been taken out of that for the moment. And the reason we did that is because of the classic thing. You go into a soccer club and you start talking about asymmetries and you see the eyes glaze over and the physio says, well, they're asymmetrical, it's an asymmetrical sport, go away. And so we say, yeah, we're not going to compare, we're not going to use 0 as, you know, the Da Vinci thing as the criterion. We're going to use other soccer players, and let's look at what the analysis that we did was, are they more asymmetrical than already asymmetrical soccer players? So what you can see is there's significant asymmetries in that little peak there on the right between 80 and 100 in normal without ACL players, and then on the right you see that asymmetry sort of spreads like a bit of a plague right across the concentric phase and through the eccentric. And this is part of talking to Laurie's, you know, where do we go next, is some of the visualizations around things will change over time. So Matt Jordan's work with skiers is one of the, you know, landmark pieces around asymmetries in elite athletes quite post, again, I think 18 months on average ACL. I think what's fascinating about that data is the symmetry of the uninjured, what you look at around 0 to 1. And so on the right you have on the right you see some soccer data with some of the same metrics. So concentric impulse, for example, the uninjured players on average are 4% with a standard deviation of 2.8. So based just on a statistical model, a player with 7% asymmetry in concentric impulse asymmetry is extremely abnormal from a soccer perspective. But what you see is that if you said 7% asymmetry in the eccentric phase, eccentric decel RFD, that is very normal. In other words, you've got to look first at sport specificity and don't use rowers, skiers or weightlifters, Olympic weightlifters who are bilateral sport as a criterion for soccer, American football, basket and so forth. And probably you need to maybe go actually sport specific, but at least somewhat around the demands. And then you need to look at the phase. So it's like, you know, a non-S&C person might say, how strong are you? You might say, well, what do you mean, bench press, squat, right? So how asymmetrical are you? Oh, which phase? Right, you could get into a really interesting conversation over dinner around that. So asymmetry is, you know, we've just shown it's not correlated across tests or phases, and the criterion that you would use as an outlier vary according to phase, clearly. The other thing that I wanted to highlight here is that you've got two metrics in the same phase. One is called eccentric decel impulse, which is in the decel phase, eccentric decel RFD, same phase, different way of measuring that phase, very different profile of asymmetry in the injured players. In other words, decel RFD effect size of 1.05 is a large effect size difference between those who had not had an injury and those that had. The numbers are 20.5 and 10.5. Impulse-wise, the uninjured are also 10%, but the injured were only 12, so non-significant difference. So as much as eccentric decel impulse you talked about as a performance, it's not a very sensitive asymmetry metric, whereas RFD seems to be more so. Any questions? I'll go home. Chris looks like. Okay, so while we're at it, these are the same players, and we thought, well, let's take Gathercole and Cormac's work and say, well, what about those under the bonnet strategy metrics against CMJ? So it's not a huge sample, it's 17 and 17. But what you see here is if you just look at the effect sizes, so jump height and peak power, 0.2, 0.24, FTCT, there it's starting to get up towards it's a moderate effect size, eccentric concentric force ratio and RPD also. So what it suggests is that players with prior injury, apart from having specific asymmetry residuals, they also are left with, on average, some degree of strategy change, even though all these players were playing competitively, and they were not this moment considered injured. They were post-HAB. They should have been post-HAB, because they still exhibit deficits and these deficits are things that you talk about around fatigue, right? Because you look at FTCT and eccentric concentric ratio and fatigue. So there is a lingering effect not only on the asymmetries but on specific performance metrics. That's just...
Quick question on that.
Yeah.
So it looks here like you're comparing previously injured to uninjured. Do you have any before injury and after injury?
Not in this study, no. This is the gold when you have that. But yeah. So, and just to show the mix of injuries. So, yeah. And I think just one of the approaches, this is just again to just show, again, I might be wrong on this, but again, people ask, what do I do? And we went into, the NFL, and he said, am I allowed to, probably shouldn't say the company, but a certain company has all of these normative data and all of these Z scores and T scores and really sexy names for variables. I'm sure you can't guess who that is. But what do you have? I said, well, I actually tested one player, one NFL player last year. So what we did was say, well, let's look at what's normal for the sport. Let's get some means, SDs, and you could start to look at those extreme guys in your sport and start to ask more questions about them. I'm not saying those ones in red are going to get injured. I'm just saying, let's ask some questions about why they are so asymmetric. Oh, well, he always runs out on the right. Okay, well, that explains it. Has he got an injury history? No. Why would you want to change it necessarily? So, there's factors like that. But again, that's an approach. I'm not saying it's the right one. This is a 6-month as well. Now, just getting into some of those specific asymmetries. Notice again the little horseshoe or big horseshoe. Quality of the force prof on the uninvolved. This was a Colombian wrestler. Now, they don't jump a lot, so they were actually cleared. Well, they weren't cleared. They were cleared to compete and then tested after, and then it was too late to change it. But they were all right. So, but it's not a jump in change of direction sport. So luckily, so you can see some of the asymmetries that we look at: eccentric decel, RFD. Sorry, gone a bit trigger happy on that. There should be some more animations in here, right? Another area. So lots of asymmetries. Let's just take 1 or 2 maximum from each phase. And I say 2 because I would still look at eccentric decel impulse because it's more stable and just see how it aligns to decel RFD, and partly because ForceDecks has 4 boxes, so I think you've got to use the 4, right? Other than that, let's have a concentric and let's have a landing. And then we've got 1 from each phase and an extra spare one for the eccentric phase, or you'd take an eccentric concentric ratio based on that newer data that we've seen. And then I think once you're dealing with an individual, we've got time to get a bit more, to look at more results, as some of us like to do. So I've just highlighted that there's qualitative aspects on the left, and this is something we're going to add as a variable, is look at how the drop-off, the unloading is later on the involved side. So this is almost a bit of kinematic data without having kinematics. You can see that the gold side there is kind of maintaining an extended position as the uninvolved side is starting to flex just from that first bit. Obviously that horseshoe, and then I've circled the rate of force development on landing as being another possible thing to look at. But again, you could start with 3, and that's the kind of approach from this elite soccer data. Keep wanting to say football, but I can't. So up on here is those, 1 from each phase, and the idea was to just show the mean asymmetries in each phase post ACL, and I did have in my head the mean weeks post, and I have it somewhere, but I didn't put it in here. The average weeks post ACL when these guys were tested. A couple of interesting things about this, apart from that, is eccentric D-cell RFD was higher in those with patella grafts. It was we basically compared patella against hamstring grafts. The only variable that showed a significant difference was in the eccentric D-cell RFD, and it was higher asymmetries. Obviously, they were all significantly higher asymmetries with the patella graft, which makes kind of sense, but maybe also suggests for example, in Colombia, they don't do patella at all. In other places, they've got different do's and don'ts, but maybe, you know, that would influence your information around which specific areas you focus on in rehab, just even before you've done these measurements, knowing that there is a tendency for higher asymmetries in that phase with that particular type of graft. I've put this up because I just wanted to show that D-cell phase again, and again tempted to point at things, but if I do it with the cursor, can you see? Yeah. So the reason why those same phase, different way of calculating, this is a really good example. So this is an athlete with a tendonitis, and what you can see here, if you look at this area, if you imagine, just ignore the green for a moment and just look at this gold line and imagine that all of this area under the curve is the impulse during that phase, right? So everything from this line down is calculated as the impulse. So clearly there's more impulse on that side during that phase than in the green, which starts out here. It's occupying less area, which is essentially what impulse is the area under the curve. But then if you look at the steepness of the curve, it's this one that is steeper. So this is why you can have a D-cell RFD that's higher on this side, but an overall D-cell impulse that is higher on the other side. That's what comes out statistically, but that's a kind of visual of that. And so it's not as counterintuitive as you might think. The other thing about impulse is that apart from height in terms of force, it's also time. So you could potentially be spending longer on the involved side, which would give you greater impulse, but it's not because you're better on that side, it's because you're taking longer to do the thing that you're trying to do, the jump or the counter movement. I always think, you know, if we use the mean, if the mean was the case for rehab, then again, close your ears from Vald, including me, is you don't need force platforms, right? Because you go, well, I know that someone's at 15%, that's the mean, they're going to have this asymmetry and then they're going to end up here. But if you look at that 23, so this is the 23 in that sample, and this is the range of asymmetries. And so somewhere up there in number, the first 6 are actually less asymmetrical than the healthy footballers, the soccer players that we looked at before. And you can see this range that goes from 0.2% asymmetry up to, I think, 31 or so. That was the concentric. So each row, I keep getting told, don't use this slide because it's too complicated, but I've got confidence this time with this audience, right? So, so each row is one player and the three asymmetries across those phases. So there are some individuals with large asymmetries in all 3 phases. There are some with large landing, but low or normal concentric or eccentric, and every combination. I won't label that too much, but the point being that, again, what comes out is a lack of association between asymmetries in different phases. That's why you measure. Because if I'm hammering away at concentric, you know, force asymmetry and it's at 3%, I might not need to. Might be better focusing on load acceptance or D-cell or something. So this is just 3 players pulled out, not at random, deliberately to show kind of how that plays out, you know, in a less busy slide. And, you know, that hopefully would direct your rehab a little bit better. Always think of the concept of like cholesterol. I've got high cholesterol, go to the doctor, he gives me statin. How much? Well, more or less 20 milligrams. Should we check? No, 20 milligrams will do and your cholesterol will go down. That's not how medicine works, and we've got options to understand better the impact of that 20 milligrams of statins and also maybe to decide whether we should be using 20 or 10 in the first place. And I think we need to apply that into an athlete rehab model. So this is just to, now we talked about landing forces, this is to show that that concept of flatlining of load acceptance, another case study, but just so it's more clear from a graphical point of view. Athlete tested 6 weeks apart. This is not the same player. It's a different knee injury. Again, slight improvement in concentric asymmetry, 9 centimeters increase in jump height. Therefore, landing force goes up, as we expect. Involved side, 900 newtons more. No, I'm not having any of that. I'll stay where I am, thank you very much. And the uninvolved side takes up the, in this case, it didn't result in a rupture or so forth, but that particular player, based on that data, so there was a decision point around physio saying, not sure I like the way he moves, but he's run the fitness coach having objective data that his velocity is increasing in straight line running, let's move to change the direction on the platform. And someone that I'm mentoring at this club said the wrong thing when he saw the results. He said, oh my God. And it didn't look good for the players. He said, 9 centimeters better, 9 centimeters improvement in jump height. That's why I was saying that, not because he's got 50% asymmetry on landing. Went for a scan and was operated 2 days later because his cartilage was in a mess. So, and he blames the force platform, unfortunately, because of the surgery was blamed on the force platform. But obviously, if he'd gone out and started to do all these change of direction, probably wouldn't have been in good shape. So, not an uncommon one. Now, another reference to someone, this is one I had to put together because of Daniel talking about testing under load. And I think we've got an issue around testing under velocity. This is a beauty because look at those two curves. In between that was an ACL rupture. And that on the right is the first test post ACL. I don't see any asymmetries at all, hardly. And in fact, those are the numbers. Pre-ACL, 2.3, post-ACL, 3.6. First test, I think you know what I'm talking about. 0.85. Wow, that's good. I mean, he's just come out of surgery, or the first test he's cleared. What do we notice about that right-hand side curve relative to it? I haven't put the blue on it, but look at the blue phase. It's taken a while, right? So if we look at this, it gets weirder, and then it makes sense. 5 weeks after that test, he suddenly got big asymmetries again, 13 and 13.5. So the first test post ACL has got low asymmetries, and then 5 weeks later, after starting to train a bit, asymmetries increase. What's going on? So what I did was I looked at the peak velocity, and just as a gauge, so his CMJ, his pre-injuries peak velocity in the eccentric phase, the way he did it, 1.48. That first test post, 0.79. If you don't put velocity in, you're not testing, you're not challenging the system, and you don't create asymmetry. So that is a moving target, and I would say this eccentric peak velocity post-injury is an objective measure of subjective willingness to actually create deceleration or demand for deceleration and high eccentric forces. And you can see the CMJ depth as well, 40, it's gone down to 30, starting to come back up, and the eccentric decel RFDs overall. So again, if you've lost 4,000 newtons of RFD that you don't need to break, actually I can handle it even on the involved side. So we really need to understand sometimes it's not just the numbers, okay, that's his capabilities under the conditions you've created, like you were saying, of load or of velocity. Doesn't mean you have to say you must go fast and you just first test after ACL, but you need to know what's causing your data, what's underneath your data. Any questions?
You showed some extreme examples there, like eccentric duration. Do you think there's anything in like an altered strategy in terms of eccentric duration, and that being a good marker of like, something that's subconsciously happening with the athlete to change strategy in response to some soreness or some fatigue? Like, where is that coming out in more subtle situations?
I think it is, and I think I may have an example of a sort of trend in that, because it's not going to be a unilateral variable. So as everyone knows, you can't get eccentric duration asymmetries. So you are depending on that bilateral variable, and there is, again, it's not enough to be definitive about it, but there's certainly seen examples of where the increase in eccentric duration or decrease in peak velocity is associated in an individual with some change. And I think you would have sort of touched on that a little bit in a couple of those case studies, is that change in strategy and then a soft tissue issue, if you like. So I think it can be used. It doesn't have to be asymmetries that's going to provide that information.
Perhaps more sensitive than the lumping it together with like the whole contraction time, which has been done.
Yeah, I mean the interesting thing about the whole is that what we've seen as well is eccentric and concentric going in opposite directions, duration-wise. So which could maybe mask a little bit that change. And I'm not sure why that is. This is one of those things, and I think someone was asking about different athletes or sports having different metrics to look at. I'm seeing individuals where concentric duration is just rock solid. It doesn't change week after week after week, and others that fluctuate. Majority it's expressed in eccentric duration, but then I wonder whether there's certain characteristics that will mean that concentric duration or other variables that aren't the classic ones will show evidence of fatigue or so forth. So I tend to, if we're going to go minimalist, jump height, FTCT and eccentric duration, but then maybe have your concentric duration just on the side to just check and see who expresses those changes in that as well. Right, we'll leave that for next Saturday. So a quick one about bilateral. So I promised this, and I think it's really important. So, that term compensatory strategy, where does that come from? There's a guy at St. Louis Cardinals, Butler, yeah. Rob Butler's some work from there. Christian Baumgart in Germany, who's an unsung hero of compensatory strategies. The concept of a sort of nice term for talking about, is this really an asymmetry? Is it a deficit in ability, or is it a strategy just to avoid using that limb to load or to produce force? And so this is a nice example. This is a basketball player, same day. Up top you see the bilateral CMJ asymmetries, and what you see is a consistent right-sided asymmetry with a mean of around, 13%. And then below you have single leg jumps on the left and on the right. And I've just pulled out two things because I took concentric impulse because it's the same thing we can have, so we have like for like. And what we see is almost with less than 1% asymmetry in concentric impulse expressed in a single leg jump, and 13% when he's got standing on both feet and given that option. And then on the right is the jump height. And in fact, in jump height, he's actually better on the side that's got the deficit in the bilateral. So what is going on? This is a case study that I'm not going to go into, but the questions start to be asked. And so this particular player had patellar tendonitis on the right side, which then made it even weirder because usually a lot of the time they unload the side with an issue. So why is he loading more on the right, got problem on the right? Again, it goes against some of the expectations. So again, conversation, player 6 months back from a left-sided ankle injury. So then the reasoning was he's developed a strategy to load the right more. That's caused the patellar tendonitis. and that is driving that avoidance strategy when he can avoid it. But he's actually got pretty much equal strength on both sides. Why would he not express it on the single leg jump? I guess one thing that we may or may not forget about the single versus the double leg jump. We say, well, it's more difficult, you're balanced and set. Think about the velocity. The velocity of descent in a single leg jump is probably 30 to 40% slower than in a CMJ, in a bilateral CMJ. So you've immediately got less of a demand for braking in the single leg jump. Okay, so it's not quite apples, it's maybe apples and pears rather than apples and oranges or oranges and oranges. Time, okay, all right. How long have I got? Yeah, people are getting, all right. So let me choose the highlights of the rest. Right.
We could be here all week.
Yeah. Actually, it's not that much. NFL data. Right, let's finish up with one little piece that I think I've been wrong about doing absolutes and ignoring direction when looking at asymmetry. So I would typically take, left in ForceDecks, and I mean anyway, you have to choose you're going to say it's +6, it's right side asymmetry minus, or somehow. You can't really do it any other way. There's some new trigonometrical way of assessing asymmetry, but so you just go, well, what's the link between magnitude of asymmetry and injury? And then you find out there is or there isn't a risk or an association. So this was done with Army cadets, and what I just highlight up there is that you were just at risk if you had a right side dominance. So it wasn't so much overall magnitude, but it was which side that dominance was that was a risk factor in these Army cadets. A 6-month follow-up study. So rifles, carrying rifles, things, there's demands I think we need to think about in terms of risk. What's the dominance, the direction, and the demand? So it could be that a player that has said, never had an issue, large asymmetries, not a history of injury, and then he gets switched to the other side of the field and has to now then produce or decelerate with that limb that hasn't, that becomes a risk factor. If he just stays where he is, he's fine. So I think we need to start thinking about dominance and demands and not just magnitude of asymmetry if we're trying to apply asymmetry as a risk factor. Now, what I want to finish up on is something quite exciting from the same thing, and we'll take a couple of minutes to get the head round. And it touches on what David brought up about eccentric mean power and eccentric decel RFD. I'm gonna, in this analysis, EPP is eccentric peak power rather than mean. So it's the same, it's a measure of eccentric power, and then the EDRFD is eccentric decel RFD. So we've got 136 Army cadets. I know they're not, well, I know they weren't particularly athletic when they came in, so we have to take that with a pinch of salt, the applicability in other groups. The injuries were principally medial tibial stress and tendinopathies. So there weren't many hamstring injuries, ACLs. No, I think there was one ankle injury. And we just looked at the lower extremity injuries, majority of which are these overuse injuries. So ignore the left for a moment and just look at high EPP versus low EPP. The red number is the number of injuries, is the number injured, and the green number is uninjured. So in high EPP, 8 injuries, 44 uninjured. And in the low EPP, and by low, we just took a median split for the group. So there's no external standards, not like the Nord board where you got the number, right? It's within 26 against 54, right? So this is in process, but the odds ratios are about, I think, 2.7 to 3 with low EPP. You can see it's a 33% risk. But when it gets really interesting is when you do go to the left and we split it up into quadrants. Now what you look at is clearly a correlation between eccentric peak power and eccentric decel RFD. well, it's eccentric performance. There should be a correlation. But just because there's a correlation, does that mean these two variables are always related in an individual? Maybe they should be, and maybe when they're not, there could be either an issue or an advantage. And what we can see pretty clearly on this data is if you go, and the hunch was, and this was something we talked about, I think Drew, with Daniel, with Dave, and someone in the, I think in the NFL as well, around this concept that, and again, I'm going to get very unscientific, but imagine a sports car with poor shock absorbers going over a speed bump, right? So that's your high EDRFD, but low eccentric peak or mean power. And they fall into the bottom right. Okay, so they're very good. They create stiffness very quickly, but overall, their power in the eccentric phase is low. Look at their risk ratio. 50% of those guys ended up with overuse injuries. Now, there's not a lot in that quadrant because clearly there's a correlation. So, but if you look at the other extreme, low EDRFD, high eccentric peak power, they're happy. They're probably not very athletic, but they haven't got much pain. And then the other two groups are fairly similar. So this is a sort of Nordic hamstring moment for eccentrics in the triple extension exercise that is a CMJ in terms of, obviously it's not only quad, but it's quad dominant. So I think apart from the concept of asymmetries, we should be looking at particularly eccentric variables as a potential robustness factor, and maybe combinations of these variables. We did this with machine learning. I say we. I asked someone to do machine learning on it and they did it. I've got no idea how to do it. But that's how we pulled out some of these combinations of variables, and with a bit of sort of a bit of insider knowledge that these might be of interest to look at. Otherwise, you just get pages and pages. Right, so I think we need to look at that more. And right, see if this works. I've never done a video live. So the last bit to finish on, I've been given license to talk about Medellin for a moment. Potentially, we'd like to do, I would, and these guys have sort of said, yeah, maybe, a performance neuromuscular conference in the beautiful city of Medellin in Colombia, where I live near to. And I'd just like to get a sort of general sense of people go, huh? Or would people come?
I'll be there.
Okay. Oh, all the Vald guys are coming. Right. Texas, USA Soccer, Sacramento. Okay, that's good enough. He's already coming. So he's... yeah, so we're brainstorming over that. Different location, interesting place to visit, and hopefully it will come off, and we'll let you guys know. We'll give you more notice next time on the conference. Thank you very much. You might want to do questions after Matt, because so you can get on. Or
We've got time for a couple of quick questions, if anyone's got them. Unfortunately, the questions you ask Dan are normally quite complicated because that's where he operates at that level. I have a random question. So is there any metrics you used to think were really important that you've now disproved? Like 5-10 years ago, that something you were measuring that you thought, this is it, we've got it, and then now you're like,
no, because
right.
No, because I didn't have the access to look at those things. I've generally the drive has been that I think I've always been wrong, so that's why I tried to, which I think is a good motivator.
It's a good place to be in, so.
Not sure. Need to know more.
What about same question for test types, like the amount of testing you used to do?
Yeah, I had files of stuff that never got. Yeah, I think that's why I've gone to the other extreme. I wouldn't say don't do the other tests, but I think you have to have a good reason, a performance question or rehab question around adding stuff. And you may say, talk about American football with the lineman. Maybe it's not even a CMJ, maybe it should be a squat jump instead. There's some exceptions where maybe that's not even, there's another better test straight off, or guys that have been doing drop jumps for a long time and really know how to do it, and they work at peak velocity a lot of the time, then maybe that is a good test. Or a picture, Ash test, or someone saying, or posterior chain, or, you know, I mean, I'm talking about force platform stuff, but obviously, you know, it might be the Nord board that's the priority for that individual. But I think we just need to be a bit more, we should start with sort of being stingy about it.
Got a question?
Good luck.
What's the future? Is it finding more about CMJ and what's going on, or is it trying to affect what's going on?
Well, that's where hopefully the guys on the ground. I mean, I'd love to. I used to do S&C years ago. I used to do personal training S&C, do programs, and like I could seem to just trying to cope with understanding the better way to evaluate and give that information. I'd love to learn more about that, but I think at this point it is a case of understanding which training affects which variables, and then how that links into either performance or risk or robustness, which I like to, you know, recovery, not necessarily injury, but recovery from competition. And I think we've got some clues already, but it's kind of people going out there and applying things, and the lab that is, you know, on the ground sport. But that is absolutely, it's interventions. I'll keep working out better things to evaluate, but, you know, I think I probably should, too old to relearn S&C. So I don't have the answers, I just think it's worth doing, yeah.
Yeah, now I realize there may be intellectual property barrier here, but how do you calculate rate of force development?
Oh, no, there's no.
It's a tricky metric because it's so sensitive.
Well, I mean, it's the way we do it is it's an average over the slope. The starting point is the maximum negative velocity. So when we talk about eccentric decel, we're defining the start of it as basically that lowest point in the velocity curve. And from there, so you're going up, and it's actually always where force crosses body mass. So it's kind of easy to find it. And then it's the slope up until the end of the eccentric phase. So it's force change over time change. Where it doesn't work is actually, for example, in that tendonitis example, what happens a lot seems to be with the ACL examples is that up until that point, the curves can be more or less together, and at the decel point, they start to spread out. But what you can also have is if they start spreading out earlier, if the asymmetry begins, let's say, just after minimum force, then by the time you've got into the decel phase, it's kind of, the RFDs become much less meaningful. So, you know, I think that's where it goes wrong, and where you'll see in ACLs, you'll see quite consistent decel RFDs, but I think where things are happening at other joints and with tendonitis, I think it happens a bit earlier for some reason. So it's good to be able to go back to the curve, and then you can use what we call the braking asymmetry, which starts earlier. So there's a solution there, or there's a sort of second plan B.
Good work, DC.
Thanks.